Hello, today we are going to talk about the ACPT administrative trend for updating the MSSP benchmark. This is a new rule that's being implemented with the 2024 rules, and it's really targeted at addressing kind of the second of the two ratchet effects. If you joined us in previous videos, we've talked about that CMS has recognized there's two basic ratchets that occur in the MSSP program. One occurs when we rebase. So when you start a new contract period and your benchmark's now lower because you had previous positive performance. The other ratchet occurs as a result of using the region's trend to update your historical benchmark. And what happens is the more of the region that you are, and that all ACOs are, this is included, those your beneficiaries are included in the region calculation and the national calculation. So the larger proportion of that is covered by MSSP and the larger proportion of MSSP that is having success in lowering costs, those costs lower. So that trend is lower than it would be. And so this is the second of these two ratchet effects, is that if the ACOs didn't exist, we would expect a higher trend. And so now when we're comparing, we're actually comparing to a lower trend. So we're not updating that benchmark as much as we might if the ACO in general didn't exist, or if your ACO in specific didn't exist. So in order to address this, CMS has said, well, let's use an administratively set benchmark. An administratively set benchmark is basically a benchmark that's not set based on the actual occurrence. So we don't take the actual data. CMS creates projections. So the Office of the Actuaries, they look out and they say, this is what we expect spending to be over the next several years. And that's how they set the benchmark. So it's not based on the actual happening, the actual costs that are incurred over time. And so it's free from some of the problems of benchmark or the update factors based on real trends. Now, it brings in its own set of issues as well. So what Medicare is doing is, in the MSSP program, they're actually going to blend this administrative trend with the current method of using a national regional blended trend in order to kind of introduce this administrative benchmark. This is really timely because CMS came out and they said they want to increase fee-for-service beneficiaries in value-based programs to 100%. Well, if we get 100% involvement in MSSP, what we're going to have is, when we compare to the national or the regional, the entire population is affected by the program. And so we wouldn't have a real counterfactual. So this administrative set trend is meant to somewhat address that. So let's dive into the details of exactly how this is going to be calculated. So here we have our flowchart of the administrative trend when we're updating the historical benchmark. Now, one thing that's really important to remember and recognize is that this only applies to the benchmark update. There is an updating process within calculating the historical benchmark where we update BY1 and BY2 to look like BY3. That is going to use the traditional national regional blended trend, and we'll update in that traditional method. This is only going to be used for updating the historical benchmark to reflect PY years. So I have this displayed here, and most other of the flowcharts in this tool or that we've gone over in these videos, I don't break it out by entitlement group. I only did it here because emphasizing that CMS is not going to come up with a separate trend for each of the entitlement groups. They will come up with two trends, one trend for the non-ESRD and one trend for ESRD. So the non-ESRD will apply to the disabled, age non-dual, and age dual groups. And so that's what this whole flowchart is pointing out, that it's a little busier because of that, but really you can follow just kind of one line, and it's the same calculations for each of the entitlement groups. This is just really to emphasize and help us remember that it is the same trend being applied to multiple entitlement groups. So the first thing is CMS, or OACT is going to come up with these prospective trends. And now they've said in their documentation that they're going to come up with an annualized trend. However, they also state that they will use multiple annualized trends. And this means that you might have a different growth factor for each year. But in general, there should be a similar growth factor between years. So basically what they've said is, as long as that average growth factor is really consistent and we don't think it's going to jump a whole bunch in a year, we're going to use the same one. But if we think there's going to be some variability within that 5-year contract, they may choose to use a separate trend. They've put out a document that highlights this, and they use the actual USPCC, a modified USPCC, to show how this might play out. And they went back and they played it out for all the start years that we've had to this point. So they're going to give this to ACOs at the beginning of their start agreement period. And so it'll detail the next 5 years of growth. And so this is exactly what you'd receive. If you started in 2014, you would see that you're going to get these growth update factors in each year. Now, you'll notice that in some cases they are conserved. So this is where that annualized trend over these 3 years, it's the same. But they must have felt that there was going to be something fairly different in 2023, and so that needed its own growth factor. These also can change from year to year. You'll notice the diagonals represent the same year, and you'll see that, you know, the growth from 22 to 23 for the projections from 22 was 5.3%. But then when we look in 23, they're saying, well, we actually think that this is going to be 8.7. So they do change over time. And there's some guardrails in place that we will talk about at the end that kind of help to deal with when the administrative trend wasn't correctly predicted. And that really is one of the big issues with an administrative trend is sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes CMS gets their prediction wrong, and there might need to be adjustments. In other programs, they have kind of adjustment factors that are applied at the end, which can be a little frustrating to organizations when you are expecting one trend and they come back and say, well, we're actually going to use a slightly different trend because we were off. And we'll go over, they're not going to do that with MSSP necessarily, but they might change the blend amount. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is a really helpful table to understand what this annualized trend is. So the first thing that we do, now that we have this trend for each year, we have to create a cumulative trend. And so that's done with a pretty simple calculation. So this update calculation is done each and every year. And so based on what year, you need to come up with that cumulative trend. And it's a really simple calculation. It's basically you take that, whatever's in that table, you add 1 to it. And so for PY1, you simply just add 1 to that number. That's what your growth rate is going to be. For PY2, you're calculating cumulative. So you take the growth rate from PY1, which in this case is 1.094, and then you're just going to multiply it by the growth rate in PY2. So in this case, that's 1.053. So you multiply those together and you get 1.152. You then take the cumulative and you keep using that in the subsequent year calculations. And that's how you're going to calculate your cumulative growth rate in this program. So that's the very first step. And I just have that in one box here. We are then going to take the 1 off of it. So we're going to subtract 1 from that number, and we're going to end up with something that's like a percentage, 10% or something. And then we're just going to go through one of these rows here. So the next step is we're going to convert this to a flat dollar amount. And so you then multiply that growth factor times the national PMPY for that specific entitlement group in BY3. Then you're going to multiply this by the ACO HCC. So we're reflecting the specific risk of your individual ACO. And that's going to, so then we're going to have this risk adjusted dollar amount. And then we're going to convert that back into a trend. So we're going to divide by the ACO's historical benchmark for the disabled group in this top row. So now we're back to a percentage. We add 1 to get back to that growth factor so that we can multiply out and have our trend. Now, simply, this is where we have our ACPT trend factor, and this is going to get multiplied by 1/3 or 0.333, and your traditional national regional blended trend factor is going to get multiplied by 2/3 or 0.666. And then those will be added together, and that becomes your trend for the disabled group. And that's done for each and every entitlement group. And that's how this is all going to be applied. Now let's take a minute to talk about some of the guardrails. Because this is a new rule, CMS has put in a few things to try to ensure that ACOs aren't unfairly having any issues because of a prospectively set trend, as well as protecting themselves if they get the trend wrong. So the guardrails for ACO, the thing that protects ACOs is that if under this new 3-way blend, you would have greater losses than under the 2-way blend, then they will use the 2-way blend. But this only applies to losses. It does not apply to gains or shared savings. So if under the 3-way blend, you would have gains, but you'd have more gains under the 2-way blend, they will still use the 3-way blend. Similarly, if you have losses under the 3-way blend, but you have gains under the 2-way blend, you won't have losses, but you won't get any shared savings as well. So it's kind of like you can't get extra benefit if you're already performing well, but it does save you on that downside risk if it happens to be worse to be using this 3-way blend. Now, one of the guardrails for CMS, and this is really a guardrail for ACOs as well, is this unforeseen circumstances. So really think COVID. The trend prediction for COVID years was, there's no way to predict that. And so they have said that basically if there's some circumstance that couldn't have been predicted, they may change that blend amount down. So instead of using the 3-way blend at 1/3 ACPT and 2/3 traditional method, they may choose to use 10% of have the ACPT only account for 10% or less. I mean, they can adjust that down to reduce the effect of that predicted trend if that predicted trend was really wrong for some reason. So those are the guardrails that are in place. I hope this really helped to explain the ACPT administrative trend, and we hope that you will join us in other videos as well.